What's up, everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. I've touched on Kharg Island across several videos, but this story keeps growing. We're now looking at least 4 separate strike waves, a documented oil spill visible from space, Iran accusing the UAE of letting its territory be used to launch attacks on the island, and Trump himself publicly admitting he's not sure America has the stomach for actually seizing it. Let's break down the full picture. I'll walk through the 4 confirmed strike waves in order, then the oil spill detail that adds a genuinely new dimension, then the UAE accusation that pulls yet another country into this, then Trump's own candid hesitation about seizure, and finish with my take on why this island keeps returning to the center of the war. The first strike came March 13th, hitting more than 90 military sites, described by CENTCOM as having totally obliterated every military target on the island, deliberately leaving oil infrastructure intact. Days later, on March 15th, Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi accused the UAE of allowing its territory to be used for that specific strike, claiming the attacks on Kharg and nearby Abu Musa were launched from HIMARS systems stationed in Ras Al Khaimah and near Dubai. The UAE denied it, but Iran's own Qatam al-Anbiya command warned UAE residents to evacuate areas near Jebel Ali, Khalifa Port, and Fujairah in response. A genuinely serious escalation of rhetoric against a country that wasn't a direct combatant. The second strike came April 7th, right at Trump's Hormuz deadline. Roughly 50 sites hit, again avoiding oil infrastructure, with Iran's Mehr news agency itself confirming maritime infrastructure suffered little damage. Then came a documented environmental dimension I hadn't covered before. Satellite imagery from May 6th showed what analysts identified as a likely oil spill covering dozens of square kilometers near the island, visible on Copernicus Sentinel-2 imagery. And by early July, at the NATO summit in Turkey, Trump confirmed a 4th round, telling reporters more than 60 IRGC boats were hit overnight, 28 of them personally confirmed destroyed, with Kharg Island struck again in that same wave. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting. On June 11th, Trump posted that the U.S. would be taking Kharg Island and other oil infrastructure in the not-too-distant future, and that the U.S. would assume total control of their oil and gas markets, much like we have with Venezuela. But in a Fox News interview the same day, he said flatly, "I don't know that America has the stomach for it, to be honest," adding he remained averse to putting boots on the ground in Iran. That's a genuine public admission of internal uncertainty from the person who'd have to actually order the operation, not analyst speculation. CNN's reporting adds real texture here too. White House officials reportedly believe seizing Kharg would totally bankrupt the IRGC and could lead to a swift end to the war, but many inside the administration are wary specifically because of the ground troop commitment it would require. That internal split, some officials seeing it as war-ending leverage, others blocked by the troop commitment question, is exactly the kind of tension that explains why this threat keeps getting raised and then walked back. Iran's response to each round of threats has gotten sharper. Ghalibaf, Iran's top negotiator, posted that wrong strategies and impulsive decisions will reset the entire board for the worse, explode energy infrastructure and markets, and create an endless quagmire that you will be stuck in for years. Iran's foreign ministry separately said the latest strikes had rendered the April 8th ceasefire practically meaningless. And Qatam al-Anbiya, the same unified command I've covered in earlier videos, warned Iran would respond more severely than before if the U.S. launched further attacks. That's language suggesting Iran views a Kharg escalation specifically, more than other target categories, as crossing into a fundamentally different tier of conflict. I want to slow down on the May 6th satellite imagery, because I don't think a single sentence does it justice. Copernicus Sentinel-2 satellite data showing an oil spill covering dozens of square kilometers near an island that handles 90% of a country's oil exports is a genuinely significant environmental and economic event, regardless of what specifically caused it. I want to be careful here. The available reporting identifies this as a likely oil spill based on satellite analysis, not a confirmed attributed incident with a clear cause. It could stem from damage sustained during one of the earlier strike waves, from normal loading and transfer operations at a facility now operating under wartime stress and reduced maintenance capacity, or from some other cause entirely that hasn't been publicly detailed. What I can say is that an oil spill of that scale, dozens of square kilometers, at the single most concentrated oil export choke point in Iran's entire economy, represents exactly the kind of collateral damage risk that comes with sustained military pressure applied in close proximity to critical infrastructure, even when strikes are deliberately avoiding the oil facilities themselves, as every official account of every strike wave I've covered has emphasized. Facilities operating under repeated nearby bombardment, with air defenses destroyed and normal operations disrupted, become more prone to accidents, leaks, and infrastructure failures even without any direct hit, simply through the compounding strain of operating in an active war zone for months at a stretch. That's worth remembering as its own category of risk, separate from the deliberate strike versus spare the oil terminal pattern I've documented throughout this story. I also want to dig deeper into the UAE accusation, because I think it deserves more attention than a single paragraph gives it. Iran directly naming a specific neighboring country, alleging its territory was used to launch HIMARS strikes against Kharg and Abu Musa, and then having its own military command issue an evacuation warning for civilian areas near major UAE ports, represents a genuinely serious diplomatic and military threat against a country that has tried throughout most of this war to maintain a more balanced, less directly involved posture than some of the other Gulf states I've covered, getting pulled into this conflict. The UAE's denial is worth taking seriously too. There's no independent confirmation the accusation is accurate, and Gulf states have real incentive to distance themselves publicly from any operational role in strikes against Iran, given how directly exposed they are to Iranian retaliation, something I've documented extensively across this entire series with Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and Jordan, all absorbing direct strikes at various points. But regardless of whether the specific HIMARS claim is accurate, the fact that Iran was willing to publicly name the UAE and threaten its port infrastructure this early in the war, back in March, tells you Kharg Island's defense and retaliation calculus was never going to stay contained to just the US and Iran bilaterally. Any country perceived, rightly or wrongly, as facilitating strikes against this specific island risked being pulled directly into the crossfire, exactly the kind of escalation pattern I've tracked repeatedly throughout this war, whenever a particularly sensitive target gets hit. I want to go back to something in Trump's own June 11th post that I only quoted in passing, his statement that the U.S. would assume total control of their oil and gas markets, much like we have with Venezuela. That's a genuinely revealing comparison because it tells you Trump isn't describing a temporary military denial operation. He's describing something closer to a long-term structural assumption of control over Iran's entire oil export economy, modeled explicitly on an existing precedent from a completely different theater. I've mentioned in an earlier video, when discussing the locked and loaded statement and its cancellation, that the U.S. has been simultaneously running operations in Venezuela and the Caribbean alongside this Iran war, competing for the same finite pool of military resources and attention. Trump explicitly drawing that comparison suggests the administration may be thinking about a Kharg Island seizure not as an isolated, one-off military operation specific to this war, but as an application of a broader template the administration has already been developing and applying elsewhere. Direct American assumption of control over a hostile state's key energy export infrastructure as a tool of both military pressure and longer-term economic leverage. That's a genuinely significant strategic framing if it reflects real administration thinking rather than just a rhetorical flourish, because it suggests any eventual Kharg operation wouldn't necessarily be treated as a temporary wartime measure to be reversed once hostilities end, but potentially as a more permanent assertion of control, exactly the kind of open-ended commitment that likely explains why, as CNN reported, many inside the administration remain wary of actually pulling the trigger on it. I want to bring in the historical parallel that CBS News flagged, because it genuinely deepens the picture here. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein repeatedly sent Iraqi aircraft to bomb Kharg Island specifically to choke off Iran's oil revenue, understanding even then that this single concentrated node represented Iran's most vulnerable economic pressure point. That's the exact same strategic logic driving every strike wave I've covered in this video, 4 decades later, against the same island for essentially the same underlying reason. That historical repetition tells you something important. Kharg's vulnerability isn't a new discovery specific to this war. It's a well-understood, long-standing strategic reality that's shaped Iranian and adversary military planning for decades. Iran has had 40 years of warning that this specific facility represents its single greatest point of economic vulnerability in any major conflict. And the fact that it still handles 85 to 95% of the country's oil exports through this same concentrated location tells you Iran has never found a way to meaningfully diversify away from that vulnerability, whether due to the enormous infrastructure cost of building comparable alternative export capacity, the specific deepwater geography that makes Kharg uniquely suited for loading massive tankers, or some combination of both. Whatever the reason, that persistent, decades-long vulnerability is exactly what makes this island such an enduring flashpoint every time Iran finds itself in a major war, and exactly why it's resurfaced as a live strategic question in this specific conflict as consistently as it has across every phase I've documented. I want to go back to something General Keane said that I only partially quoted earlier, because his full framing deserves more attention. He specifically said seizing Kharg would put the Iranian regime in checkmate, Breaking down the numbers directly, it represents 50% of Iran's budget, 60% of government revenue, and 80 to 90% of its oil distribution points, all concentrated in one location. That's a genuinely staggering concentration of economic dependency in a single, relatively small piece of territory, roughly 8 kilometers long and 4 to 5 kilometers wide, according to Al Jazeera's own geographic breakdown. The chess metaphor is worth taking seriously as more than just colorful language. A checkmate in chess isn't simply a strong move. It's specifically a move that ends the game entirely because the opponent has no remaining viable options. Keane, using that specific word, suggests his raid on Kharg isn't that seizing it would meaningfully degrade Iran's position, the way most of the target categories I've covered throughout this war function. It's that it would end Iran's ability to continue the war in any meaningful sense at all, by removing the majority of the government's actual revenue base in a single operation. That's a categorically different claim than "this would help." It's "this would end it," which is exactly why I think this remains the single most significant piece of leverage in America's entire toolkit against Iran, more consequential in Keane's own explicit framing than any of the missile, command center, or even nuclear facility strikes I've covered in detail across the rest of this series. I want to bring in one more detail I found in this latest research, because it complicates the picture in an interesting way. AP's own reporting, citing maritime intelligence firm Tanker Trackers. COM noted Iran had exported 7 million barrels of oil since the war started, and that multiple tankers were observed on satellite imagery, actively loading at Kharg, even amid all of this military pressure. That's a genuinely important data point. It tells you that despite 4 separate strike waves, the accusations against the UAE, and the documented oil spill, Kharg Island has continued functioning as an active oil export terminal throughout nearly this entire war, exactly consistent with the deliberate pattern I've described of every strike avoiding the actual oil infrastructure. That continued functionality is worth weighing against Keane's checkmate framing. If Kharg were already offline or severely degraded, you wouldn't expect to see active tanker loading operations continuing on satellite imagery well into the war. What that tells you is that the checkmate move Keane described remains genuinely unplayed. This isn't a case where the US has been slowly grinding down the island's actual export capacity through a series of near misses. It's a case of extremely precise, deliberate restraint, systematically destroying every layer of military defense protecting the island, while leaving the actual revenue-generating function completely intact and operational. That's about as clean an illustration as this entire war has produced of the difference between degrading an adversary's military capability and degrading their underlying economic capacity. 2 very different categories of pressure that have been kept almost entirely separate throughout this specific piece of the conflict. Christian Emery's assessment from University College London captures the actual gamble here well. Trump would be betting that Iranian leadership, faced with losing tens of billions in annual revenue, would simply capitulate rather than fight on. That's a real plausible outcome given how central this island is to Iran's entire economy. But Trump's own public hesitation, "I don't know that America has the stomach for it," tells you this specific option carries a political cost calculation even the person threatening it isn't fully resolved on. Combined with the internal administration split CNN reported and Iran's own escalating rhetoric specifically around this target, I think Kharg Island remains exactly what General Keane described, an option held in reserve rather than a plan actively being executed, but one that keeps getting dusted off every time this war reaches a new plateau. I also think the continued tanker loading activity I just described is the most important reality check available right now. 4 strike waves, a documented spill, threats of seizure repeated across months, and Kharg Island is still, as of the most recent satellite tracking, actively exporting oil. That tells you the checkmate move genuinely remains on the table rather than already being partially executed through incremental pressure, and it's exactly why I think this island deserves to be watched as closely as any single front in this entire war, because unlike almost every other target category I've covered across this series, this is the one where the gap between demonstrated capability and actual usage remains the widest, and where the eventual decision to close that gap, one way or the other, could genuinely determine how this war ends. So that's the fuller Kharg Island picture. 4 strike waves, a documented oil spill, a UAE accusation dragging in yet another country, continued active tanker loading despite months of surrounding military pressure, and Trump's own public uncertainty about whether America actually has the appetite to finish the job. This remains, in my assessment, the single most significant piece of unused leverage in this entire conflict, precisely because every other major escalation option I've covered throughout this series has already been at least partially exercised, while Kharg's actual oil infrastructure has been consistently, deliberately spared. I'll keep tracking this closely. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe for the next update. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.